Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Joining us now, David Austin Walsh, postdoctoral associate at the Yale Program for Study of Antisemitism, college fellow at the University of Virginia, author of Taking America Back, the Conservative Movement in the Far Right. David, welcome back to the not welcome back, but welcome to the program. And I should say, timing your book pretty good. Donald Trump seemed to sort of give you an assist in many respects with J.D. Vance. We'll get to that. But first, for our audience, give us the broad strokes on William F. Buckley, because I'm of an age where, William F. Buckley was the guy. Having gone to college in the 80s, he was the guy for conservatives at that time. But I don't know that people... he is as prominent in people's minds or younger people's minds. So just give us the broad view of who he was for Republicans and the conservative movement.
Sure. I mean, let me start by saying this. I mean, everybody who is in this line of work, who writes books about the right, the American right, always says that their first book, I was just talking about this with a friend of mine the other day who wrote a book about far right in Texas. Your first book is always about... it's a letter to your parents, right? And so his was about why his parents thought that William F. Buckley was a liberal. Mine is directed at my very liberal parents who used to watch William F. Buckley on TV and thought he's one of the reasonable ones. He's one of the good conservatives. So for the audience here, so William F. Buckley was probably the most prominent conservative pundit and intellectual in the second half of the 20th century, largely because of a show that he had on PBS called Firing Line, which was on from 1966, I think it might have even been 65, basically to the end of the century. And he had on everybody on this show over the years. He started off with interviewing people like George Wallace. He had Ann Coulter on at the end, a lot of arts and media people, and it sort of made his in many respects it was sort of set the template for what sort of conservative right-wing punditry on TV looked like. So that's why everybody knows him. I mean, and he was everywhere in pop culture in the second half of the 20th century. You ever watch Aladdin? One of the many impressions that Robin Williams does, and I think that movie came out in 93, is he does a William F. Buckley impression, because he's very famous. I'm not going to try to do it here, but he's very famous for having a distinctive mid-Atlantic accent. So it sounds like he's kind of English, he's kind of American, he's from New England, he went to Yale, so he's sort of boarding school upper crust that way, and a very distinctive style of speech. But for American conservatives, he was also sort of the leading intellectual figure on the right during this time as well. He was the founder and editor-in-chief for 40 years of the magazine National Review, which is sort of the big institutional magazine of American conservatism in the 20th century. It's still around, although its influence is much less than it used to be. He sort of made his career by writing a book in 1951 when he was all of 25, attacking Yale faculty for being a bunch of communists, called God and Man at Yale, and then followed that up with a book about how Joe McCarthy was right. So sort of a very sort of influential figure in that way. Everybody on the American right and a lot of people elsewhere in American politics were sort of connected with this guy because he was such a social figure and a gadfly throughout much of the 20th century. And he sort of forms the centerpiece of my book, because what I tried to do was, look at Buckley not just through his, the magazines he publishes and the TV show, but the friends of his who turned out to be neo-Nazis.
Yeah, and I should say just two sort of like tangential notes. One, The Millionaire from Gilligan's Island, which is also a dated reference. But also, I'm convinced he was doing Buckley for the most part in terms of an impression.
Oh yeah, Thurston Howell. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah,
Thurston Howell is definitely lovely, and I should say I would also recommend people Google Gore Vidal and Buckley.
Oh yeah.
Gore Vidal, I had the opportunity to interview a bunch of times back in the Air America days, and it was fascinating. Their exchanges were really
Best of Enemies. There's a great documentary about their relationship in those debates. I mean, anyway, like the Mid-Atlantic accent. Also, was he just copying that from Hollywood? Was that part of it as well?
There was a Brahmin sort of like thing that maybe he was sort of adopting that. There was an aristocracy issue going on here.
I think he came by it honestly because he went to, I forget what boarding school he went to, but he went to boarding schools. He went to Yale. He he grew up in that part of Connecticut. There are still kind of people who speak like that in Connecticut. Yeah. But I do think that he was kind of egging it on a little bit because Buckley, and he always had this kind of status anxiety about this throughout his life. He wasn't a WASP. He embodied like WASP and white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism, but his family was Irish Catholic. They were like new money in kind of the same way the Kennedys were. So he always had kind of that insecurity about him.
Yeah, I think we called them in Massachusetts like cut glass Catholic. I'm not sure if that's a derisive term. It's just what I heard when I was a kid. So, but be that as it may, and we should say like your the Buckley and the thesis here is that, or I should say the sort of like the second order thesis is that the relationship with Buckley is a way in which to illustrate the relationship with the mainstream republicanism with what we consider the fringe. And there's not a lot of daylight. Maybe, like it's like a screen. Yeah. There's a screen there, but the screen lets in some of that light. Let's put it that way. So let's go down. Let's go to Merwin Hart. And take it from there. Who was Merwin Hart?
Yeah, Merwin Hart is a guy who I think I first encountered him when I was doing the initial research for this book, because he was friends with Buckley's dad. Buckley's father was he made all of his money in the oil industry in Mexico and Texas in the early part of the 20th century, and so he was hobnobbing with all of these businessmen when he moved back to Connecticut, all these businessmen in sort of the New York orbit. So Merwin Hart was a guy who was he was the founder of an organization called the National Economic Council, basically a pro-business lobby in New York State in the 1930s. But before then, he was sort of like tangentially involved in politics. He was actually on Franklin Roosevelt's economic advisory, but they knew each other at Harvard. They were both Harvard classmates in the early part of the 1930s, but then decides the New Deal is evil and sort of communistic, and so founds this pressure organization, what was called the New York State Economic Council, becomes the National Economic Council in 1943, and it's a pro-business lobby group. But Merwin Hart, over the course of the 1930s, becomes increasingly radicalized and also increasingly anti-Semitic. He's convinced that the Jews are behind the New Deal. He blames Felix Frankfurter, who's one of the first Jewish Supreme Court justices, for influencing Roosevelt and the direction of the New Deal. Basically holds that communism, socialism, and New Deal liberalism are basically one and the same. And so by the end of the 1930s, he is an unofficial lobbyist for the government of Francisco Franco in Spain. He actually goes to Spain in 1939 or 1938 on basically a goodwill tour. By the way, I'm sorry if you can hear my dog.
No, I was going to say that's for folks at home. That's a dog who apparently reacts poorly to anti-Semites.
Yeah, no, that's good. She's a good dog.
Well trained. I mean, just to stop here, because I want you to tell people who Franco was too, because I'm not sure if people fully get sort of where Franco was on the political spectrum. But how much of because I'm fascinated by Merwin Hart's radicalization, and Frankfurter was also at Harvard. And at least came out of Harvard Law School. And at that time, it's like there was only a certain amount of Jews that were come in, but there was a sense like that's starting to fall apart a little bit in that era. And I wonder, what radicalizes a guy like that? What takes someone? Is it a Jewish guy, he gets divorced and his wife starts dating a Jewish guy, or what is it? Or is it like, they're desecrating my alma mater by letting Jews in, or what is it that radicalizes a guy like that?
Well, it's funny because I think that the kind of like country club anti-Semitism is so the kind of like sense that there are too many Jews at Harvard or Yale or whatever. They're knocking down some of the barriers to certain high status industries. That's where a lot of Buckley's, and he later renounces anti-Semitism, but he grows up in a very anti-Semitic household. That's where that comes from. With Hart, I think it's something different. And maybe in a way more typical of people who become sort of dedicated political, like anti-Semitism is the lens through which I see all of my politics. I think for him, it comes from organized labor. It comes from this sense that, so for your listeners who are unfamiliar with I imagine most of them probably are, with the trope of Judeo-Bolshevism or Judeo-communism. So it's this idea that communism, the Russian Revolution, is the result of a Jewish conspiracy. Communism is just a Jewish conspiracy to, seize control of the world. And there's softer versions of this in American politics in the 20s and 30s, this kind of political anti-Semitism, which is the Jews are the sort of font of radicalism in the United States, and especially in New York State, are identified with the labor movement. And if there's one thing that Merwin Hart hates, because remember, he's a business lobbyist, he hates organized labor. What really kind of turns him against Roosevelt and the New Deal in the early 1930s is he's supportive of the New Deal initially, or at least aspects of it, because the first big piece of legislation, the National Recovery Act, in the early 30s, has a clause in it which sort of mandates the recognition of labor unions. And he doesn't like that. But there's another clause that allows for basically the cartelization of industries, which means that like business leaders can, this is super illegal, at least in theory, right now, but business leaders can collaborate, meet together to set prices and coordinate competition, et cetera, would violate anti-monopoly law, and did later on. But Hart, he's a lobbyist for mid-sized businesses, right? So the idea that you can coordinate with these, and compete with the big corporations, he loves that stuff. But what he doesn't like is the labor stuff. And once the National Recovery Act is struck down by the Supreme Court and Congress passes what is called the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act, so it's the basis of contemporary U.S. labor law, where you have to legally recognize unions and collectively bargain with them in good faith. He hates that. He's totally against that. He thinks it's destructive of business. And that's for him because he identifies labor and labor activists and labor agitators with Jewish immigrants. That for him is sort of the key radicalizing moment. And it's actually very common for people of his specific generation.
Not hard to find like old photo. We may even have one in this office of old photographs of labor rallies where a lot of the signs are in Yiddish.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And we should say, like, the Shirtwaist Factory fire. I think the majority of those women in that fire, they were Jewish and Italian immigrants, and so there is that connection between sort of the labor movement that comes, out of New York City in particular, and Jews. Okay, so because I'm sort of fascinated on like how that happens. He ends up mentoring Buckley. Mm-hmm.
And one of Buckley's many mentors, I should say.
But then he also is a fan of Charles Lindbergh, who tell us Lindbergh and then also Franco, because
there's a lot of ground. Yeah, so Lindbergh's, so I'm assuming most of your listeners know about Lindbergh and know his sort of background. He's from Minnesota. He becomes an international celebrity in 1927 because of his transatlantic flight. And also has a tremendous amount of public sympathy coming his way in the mid 1930s because his son is kidnapped and murdered. But in 1939, he becomes the sort of most prominent spokesperson for the isolationist. Really, historians don't really call it the isolationist movement anymore. The non-interventionist movement against American intervention in World War II. And not everybody involved in the non-interventionist movement was, a Nazi sympathizer. It seems pretty clear that Lindbergh actually was. He wrote an essay right when the war began, basically. It was in November. I think it was in Reader's Digest. Might have been Life magazine. Basically saying that this is, a civil war between the white race and this is bad. So a very sort of committed, what we would call today a white nationalist, white supremacist. So he becomes friends with Hart because they're both agitating against American involvement in World War II. Hart has already cut his teeth a bit on international politics in the late 1930s because, again, he's a fan of Francisco Franco. Now, Franco was the guy who, in 1936, organized a failed coup against a left-wing government in Spain, kicked off the Spanish Civil War, raged for 3 years, killed hundreds of thousands of people. There were foreign interventions by the Soviet Union, by the Nazis, by the Italian fascists in favor of Soviets were against Franco. The Nazis and the fascists were pro-Franco, and yeah, Franco was basically became the fascist dictator of Spain until he died in 1975. And he was very popular in the U.S. at the time, not universally so. But for anti-communist sort of right-wingers, he was the guy who was fighting communism abroad in Spain against this evil sort of Judeo-Bolshevik international conspiracy. And for Hart, he saw it explicitly. He wrote after he got back from Spain, he went over there. He did a grand tour of the areas that Franco controlled. Came back, wrote a bunch of articles for newspapers, and wrote a book in 1939 called "America, Look at Spain," in which he says very explicitly the exact. Bear in mind that Hart in the late 30s is also going around the country, sort of teaching, basically teach-ins for local businesses to defeat labor organizing. He was really active in the Midwest in 1937, trying to break what is now called the sort of Little Steel Strike. The CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, was trying to organize the smaller steel companies at the time. Anyway, so Hart comes back in 1939 and writes this book saying, well, what I am doing in Ohio is just another front in the same global war on international communism that Francisco Franco is fighting in Spain. So he loved the guy, and he wasn't alone. And we'll get into this, I'm sure, a little bit later. But there's, the love for Francisco Franco is something that is very characteristic of the American right down to the present day. So that's who sort of Franco was.
Okay, and so at one point, and this is one of Buckley's mentors. Another, sort of, I guess, was, well, let's talk about the John Birch Society era for Merwin Hart, and how Buckley starts to, what Buckley's theory is, or genuine sensibility, I guess, as to where that sort of split happens. And this becomes sort of like a running dynamic that Buckley has with this ilk.
Yeah, so I'll jump ahead a little bit here. The big sort of foundational myth of modern American conservatism, and I don't mean myth necessarily in the sense that it's untrue, but it is a very simplistic narrative. But myth as in like the story that sort of gives them meaning, is that in 1965 or thereabouts, William F. Buckley Jr., who was one of the most prominent conservatives in the country, decisively broke with the crazies and the kooks and the sort of neo-fascists and kicked them out of the conservative movement, and made conservatism respectable. He became a responsible conservative. And there's a degree of truth to this, but the reality is far, far, far more complicated. And one of the things I try to show in the book is that prior to this point, there was this sort of deeply intertwined and intermeshed relationship between Buckley and other sort of mainstream conservatives and the so-called fringe or kooks or whatever, including the mentorship that Buckley had from people like Hart. Hart's dead by 1965. He dies in 1962. But when he dies, he's the Manhattan chapter president of the John Birch Society, which is this right-wing organization founded by candy manufacturer Robert Welch in Indianapolis, Indiana, in December 1958, and becomes this big sort of national conservative organization. I think they claim 100,000 members at their peak. They're to the point where it's sort of a national crisis in the early 1960s. Maybe for me, and I'm sure this is probably the case with many of your listeners, the first time I ever encountered them, because I was born in '89, they're still around technically, but they're pretty marginal at this point, was Bob Dylan wrote a song which talking John Birch Paranoid Blues in 1963, I think. So they were a sort of staple of popular culture.
I will say, I sadly was had already graduated college by that point that you were born, and during the mid '80s, there was the big controversy that we had was Coors beer was then just a regional beer, and they were trying to come east, and that was the big knock on Adolf Coors, was that he had ties. And the Coors family had deep ties to the John Birch Society, I think it was at that time. That may have been the last vestiges of like it being in the political sort of like centered politically in some ways.
Well, I mean, I think actually what happens, I'm sorry, we're going all over the place, but I just want to, I think what happens in the 90s is that the Birchers sort of lose their cachet as being sort of the authentic spokesperson for the far right or for the, you know, the right wing of the conservative movement. And they're supplanted by people like Rush Limbaugh. So it's less organizational. Then they also have their own internal organizational challenges. Robert Welch dies in 1985. Even prior to this, he'd been retired for a while. They had this sort of revival in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Paul Weyrich, who's this prominent conservative activist, was very closely affiliated with them. He was also big in the Reagan administration. So Reagan had a lot of these ties. But then what happens is in 1983, their president, a guy named Larry McDonald, who's a conservative Democratic congressman from suburban Atlanta, he's on Korean Airlines Flight 007, so the one that the Russians shoot down over the Sea of Japan. So he dies, and yeah, they kind of fall apart a little bit after that. But going back to the sort of the origins in their relationship with Buckley and Hart, you know, really throughout the 1950s, there's all of these efforts to organize a new conservative mass political movement. And part of this is inspired by the political success of Joseph McCarthy, and he brings in all of these people together, and they're collaborating in various ways. It leads to, among other things, the founding of National Review in 1955. But in the 1950s, the most prominent conservative magazine is not National Review. It's actually a magazine called American Mercury, which was founded back in the 20s by H.L. Mencken, the famous Baltimore journalist. But by the 1950s, it was acquired by a guy named Russell Maguire. Maguire was a businessman, also from Connecticut, made all of his money manufacturing Tommy guns for the Army in World War II, and then parlayed that into like oil wealth. It's a typical story with these guys. And Maguire is also close friends with Hart. And in fact, Hart is, I think, I'm not able to sort of say this definitively because but I think, and I try to show in my book, that Maguire gets his politics, and his politics are extremely right-wing, extremely anti-Semitic. He writes about, Jewish conspiracy theories all the time in the magazine. He gets his politics from Hart. And this is a magazine that is more influential on the right in the 1950s than anything that, William F. Buckley or any other sort of, quote unquote, moderate conservative is putting out at the time. So what happens in 1959, 1960 is that Buckley begins to distance himself from the American Mercury, from the John Birch Society, which is sort of linked to these organizations. By sort of famously in 1959, he puts out a memo saying that if you are a contributor to, if you're on the masthead of the American Mercury, you can no longer be on the masthead of National Review, which should tell you something, right? It's like one of those sort of suspiciously specific things that the Bible bans, right? Or like, the church clergy bans in the 1400s. Like that doesn't happen unless there's a lot of overlap between these spaces. And that's exactly the case.
Right. You wouldn't need to put out that edict if it wasn't an existing problem.
Right. One of his best friends, also one of his mentors, because he's a bit older than him, is a guy who's a classics professor at the University of Illinois named Revilo Oliver. They get together in the mid 1950s. Oliver was he worked for the War Department during the Second World War doing like cryptography. He's apparently a very famous or noted scholar of Sanskrit. But by 1955, 56, he becomes a conservative activist. he is the book review editor for National Review for the first 5 years or so of its existence. And he and Buckley are apparently close personal friends. They write each other warm, very sort of pompous letters to each other. They're very sort of self-consciously erudite people, so they use a lot of that kind of language. They only have a falling out in around this time in 1959 because Oliver he's a committed anti-Semite. I'm not exactly sure how he comes by that. But he is firmly convinced in the sort of Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy theory, is also writing for the American Mercury. He's one of the founding members of the John Birch Society. He's at that meeting in 1958 in Indianapolis, and he and Buckley remain close until the early 1961, 1962 is roughly when their friendship ends. And to me, that's just, and we can go into Oliver in a little bit later and how he becomes a neo-Nazi, but it is, I think it does illustrate this sort of basic dynamic of, the Birchers, these other sort of quote unquote fringe people, they weren't in the driver's seat of the conservative movement in the late 1950s, early 1960s, but they were there and they were important. Crucially, the sort of narrative that Buckley purges these people, insofar as that actually happens, it only happens after 1965. Why is that date significant? Because it's a year after Barry Goldwater loses in the 1964 elections. And Barry Goldwater was often challenged on the campaign trail about all of his close ties with these radical right-wing groups that were supporting his campaign. He would tell people, I can't disavow the John Birch Society. I can't disavow these extremists or anti-Semites or whatever, because these are the people who are my political base. These are the grassroots that are volunteering for my campaign. And so it's only after the loss that they can begin to sort of put a little distance between themselves and these organizations. But there's still a lot of sort of interplay and overlap between the two. And so that's again, it's a very, this sort of purge narrative is a very, I think, self-serving one for the conservative movement. And that's sort of what I'm trying to challenge in the book.
What was you describe Buckley as basically having a, not quite 1,000, I think, flowers bloom, but or I should say, not a popular front, but a big tent. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that the people who come into that tent, there's a big chunk of them that he has to disavow. Is it a question of has to disavow, or is he offended? I mean, because this is all happening around the time too of the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. I mean, these things didn't, just drop down out of the sky. We're building towards this. You got, George Romney, very prominent Republican back in 62 or 63. He's marching with civil rights workers. There is there's almost like a riptide. And Buckley seems to be sort of in the middle of that riptide where that convergence is happening. And is he making a strategic decision, or is he making a moral one, or what is he doing there?
Right, and I think it's a strategic decision. I mean, he would probably frame it as a moral one, but I think that's again, that's I think a self-serving narrative. I think the strategic decision is that by 1965, 66, it's very clear that the civil rights movement is not going away. It's very clear that especially after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, you're not going to get to a point like they were in 1957 when Buckley writes this infamous op-ed in National Review in which he says the South must prevail. And he says something to the effect of the white civilization in the South is the superior one. It's justified in doing anything it wants to sort of defend its position, and compares it favorably to the British in Kenya because they're going through an anti-colonial uprising, the Mau Mau uprising at the time.
But he's just talking about cultural things like Southern drinks and dress and. You know,
Well,
juleps.
so I want to be fair to Buckley here. I think what distinguishes him from, I mentioned Reveal Oliver a moment ago. Oliver is a dedicated biological racist and anti-Semite. So, and what I mean by that is that he takes as his point of departure that races exist as biological and historical entities. That history is essentially a conflict between races, and the white people as the white race needs to take possibly extreme measures to protect itself and its existence. I mean, and again, he becomes a neo-Nazi. You can see very clearly how this goes down that path. Buckley is a little bit different. He is a biological racist. He does believe that there are biological differences between, say, white people and black people. He wrote a letter. I found this sort of exchange in the archives here, actually, at the University of Virginia. One of his contributors to National Review in the 1960s was a guy named James J. Kilpatrick. Kilpatrick was the editor of the Richmond Daily Leader, I think it was what it was called. It was the big newspaper in Virginia. He was also the architect of what was called the Massive Resistance Campaign to Desegregation after Brown v. Board in 1954, the school desegregation Supreme Court decision. And so there's this exchange between the two of them about whether or not, there are biological differences between black and white people, whether or not there are IQ differences between black and white people. And Buckley says something to the effect of, well, yeah, I think that there are, but because I'm a Catholic, we should treat everybody in the context of this sort of universal Christian charity and brotherhood. So he's a biological racist, but he's paternal about it.
Out of Christianity.
Yeah, I mean,
there's an asterisk there that's like, except for the Moors.
There really is, and I mean, and this is characteristic of Buckley going back to his young adulthood. I mean, he is a child of privilege. He is, again, Yale. I remember reading these letters that he wrote. I found them in his archives to his dad when he was in the Army in World War II, and he was in officer cadet school, and he's just seething with resentment about how. And at the time, Buckley was more openly anti-Semitic, seething with resentment about how all of these poor people and immigrants and Jews were being promoted in the Army ahead of him, and how nobody liked him because he would tell his squad mates that, yeah, I just think rich people are better. I think that rich people deserve our wealth, and Franklin Roosevelt's a communist. And yeah, that was very popular with his fellow officers, officer cadets. So there is a degree of sort of paternalistic elitism with Buckley, which I think is actually characteristic of of country club conservatism, if you want to call it that, throughout most of the 20th century. But that is somewhat distinct from, or I think that is distinct from the kind of essentialist biological racism that motivates a guy like Oliver and becomes sort of the foundation of what becomes the white supremacist white power movement. It's not a coincidence, though, that many of the leading lights in that movement, Oliver is one, George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the founder and head of the American Nazi Party for most of the 1960s, is another. He was also close at one point in his career to William F. Buckley. He worked for National Review in the late 1950s. They see this guy as sort of a guy that is on their side, even if he can't say it explicitly, even if there are some sort of temperamental differences. But to answer your original question, sorry, I'm getting off tangent here, whether or not it's a moral or a strategic decision. I mean, Buckley is a guy who is willing to, and I think this is true of American conservatism writ large, is willing to kind of go along with the basic claims of the American civil rights movement by using the language of color blindness and racial equality. This is very characteristic of conservatism in the 1970s. Now, this doesn't actually mean sort of substantive agreement or concessions to the claims of the civil rights movement. I mean, they want to and eventually more or less are able to stop school integration, among other things. But it does mean that you can't explicitly say anymore, I'm a white supremacist, I think that white people are better than black people, et cetera, et cetera. Even if you believe that, and many people in National Review world did believe that, and arguably still continue to believe that to the present day, but you're not supposed to say it out loud, and you're supposed to be able to at least make rhetorical concessions to sort of anti-racism, and Buckley was able to make that journey. A lot of the other guys, these are the people who form the basis of the sort of modern white power movement, were not able to make that journey. For them, that's even too much of a concession. But even then, I mean, they still want, and this is something I try to show towards the end of the book, they still really want the approval of people like Buckley, and they still fundamentally consider themselves to all be kind of on the same side, fighting against the sort of excesses of liberalism and socialism, and what would now be called wokeness in the 21st century.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, how much of that was or ingrained in the right wing ecosystem outside of the people who were, manipulating the conversation or driving the conversation, essentially the base. Like, for me, when I watch Donald Trump today, you can just see that the white supremacists or the furthest right kind of people in the base of the Republican Party have an understanding that some stuff can't be said publicly, and that you can hint, but, he has to say that, but we know he really thinks X, Y, and Z. That training, I think, was laid bare in the Rush Limbaugh days too, but it still pays dividends for the Fox News crowd to this day. Like, how much of that was a conscious choice, and how much did you observe in your writing?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I mean, I think that there is a pattern of that really starts to intensify after the sort of advent of broadcasting, as TV in particular, but also on the radio. I mean, I remember listening to Alex Jones like 10 years ago, and sometimes they would be people who would call in with sort of like crank anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And he would come just up to the line of saying that they were right, but he wouldn't actually say it outright as a kind of way to maintain plausible deniability. So I think that, well, let me give you an example. And it goes back to the race IQ stuff. So National Review publishes a lot of material. I think I write about this in the second to last chapter. Publishes a lot of material in the 1970s about race science, what would be called race science. So they endorsed the theories of Arthur Jensen, who is, I believe, a Harvard biologist, evolutionary biologist, and he claims that you can trace differences in racial intelligence through IQ tests between black and white people and other various groups. And his work is eventually picked up by Richard Herrnstein, who then very infamously sort of collaborates with Charles Murray to write the bell curve in the 1990s. So National Review is very much, pun intended,
Andrew
ahead of the curve on this. Yeah, exactly.
Sort of like smiles and publishes it.
Yeah. So Buckley's, National Review is publishing this stuff in the early 1970s. And they're also, Buckley has on, I believe it's Jensen himself, it might be Herrnstein, I can't remember, on firing line in 1972, 73 to talk about this. And it's interesting, he has on the next year a guy named William B. Shockley, who is most famous probably as the inventor of the transistor. He was an electrical engineer, I believe, or some sort of scientist out at Stanford, invents the transistor. He becomes very sort of influential and famous because of this. By the early 1970s, Shockley is an explicit eugenicist. He's all about how, I think it's very similar to how Elon Musk is these days, right? He's all about how the right people need to be reproducing, but he's also, explicitly racist as well, right? Like the right people need to be reproducing, and the intelligent people need to be reproducing, and it's white people who we're really talking about, because you can prove that through these tests. Buckley has him on, and while he's very deferential to Jensen in 73, he's just tearing into Shockley in 74, saying, you can't say this, you're being a racist, you're a white supremacist, et cetera, et cetera. Even though what Shockley is saying is not substantively different than what Herrnstein and Jensen were saying, who had the sort of National Review seal of approval. So there's a way in which you can kind of see how I have a chapter which isn't about this episode specifically, but I called it the role of the crackpot. And the role of the crackpot on the American right, I mean, there's really kind of a symbiotic relationship, right? So you have people who are on the far right, who are explicit white supremacists, racists, Nazis, what have you, who are able to kind of push the boundaries of discourse, and then you can have sort of mainstream conservatives come in and say, oh, okay, well that's going too far. But here's somebody who's saying substantively the same thing, but has the patina of respectability, responsibility, intellectual credibility, et cetera. And that's Buckley's role in the mid 1970s to a great degree. Other people play that role at various other times too. But there is kind of a sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge aspect to it.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.